There was a moment in the summer of 1941 when one of the most brilliant military minds in the world drove his armored forces so deep into Soviet territory that the forest simply swallowed them whole. Have you ever wondered how an army that seemed completely unstoppable could suddenly find itself fighting just to survive? And what does it tell us about war when the side everyone expected to collapse is the one that sets the trap? This is the story of a battle most people have never heard of, fought in a swamp nobody wanted, that quietly changed the course of one of the most devastating campaigns in modern history. By July of 1941, Germany's Army Group North was moving at a pace that stunned even its own commanders. The armored columns had punched through Lithuania, crossed the Niemen River, and were tearing through the Baltic territories of the Soviet Union with a speed that made the planning timetables look almost conservative. The logic driving all of it was brutally simple. Move fast enough, and the enemy never gets a chance to think. Hit hard enough, and the whole structure collapses before it can reorganize. In the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, that logic seemed completely unbeatable. The man responsible for pushing Army Group North toward Leningrad was Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb. His objective could not have been clearer. Leningrad was the second largest city in the Soviet Union, the birthplace of the October Revolution, and a symbol of Soviet power that Hitler wanted erased from the map. To get there, von Lieb had one of the most powerful armored formations in the German military at his disposal, the 4th Panzer Group under Colonel General Erich Hobner. That group was divided into 2 armored corps, and it was one of them, the 56th Panzer Corps, that was about to become the center of something nobody in Berlin had predicted. The commander of the 56th Corps was General Erich von Manstein. If you know anything about the Second World War, you know that name. Von Manstein was the architect of the plan that had shattered the Allied armies in France just a year earlier. He was widely considered one of the finest operational minds of his generation, a man who seemed to understand maneuver warfare almost instinctively. He could read the gaps in an enemy's position and exploit them before the other side even realized the danger. That brilliance had won him enormous success in Western Europe, but in the forests and swamps of Northwest Russia, that same drive to push forward, to keep moving, to never stop, was quietly building the conditions for disaster. The 56th Corps was a genuinely impressive formation. Its armored backbone was the 8th Panzer Division, equipped with Panzer IIIs and IVs, and supported by the 3rd Motorized Division and the 121st Infantry Division. Together, they had the punch and the follow-through to execute the kind of deep penetration operations that Blitzkrieg doctrine demanded. In the opening days of Barbarossa, they had performed almost perfectly, crashing through Soviet front lines and crossing the Dvina River at Daugavpils with an aggression that left the Soviet command completely off balance. But here's where the story takes its first quiet turn. Every single kilometer of that brilliant advance was also one more kilometer of exposed supply lines stretching back through territory that was not Poland and was not France. The roads, where they existed at all, were more like forest tracks than military routes. The ground shifted without warning from dry soil to waterlogged marsh. The trees closed in on both sides of every path, cutting visibility down to almost nothing. And behind the armored tip of the advance, the gap between the lead tanks and the infantry that was supposed to follow them was growing into something that no doctrine had a clean answer for. That gap, by early July of 1941, had grown to over 100 kilometers in places. 100 kilometers of Soviet forest between von Manstein's forward tanks and the foot soldiers who were supposed to be holding the ground those tanks had passed through. In normal circumstances, a manageable distance becomes an operational abyss when the terrain between the two forces is a maze of rivers, bogs, and dense conifer forest that can swallow entire units without a trace. This is what military theorists call culmination, the point at which an attacking force has pushed so far beyond its capacity to sustain itself that it can no longer advance effectively and becomes vulnerable in ways it was not when the attack began. It does not announce itself with sirens and warning lights. It creeps in slowly. The fuel trucks take longer to reach the front. The ammunition gets held up on tracks that become mud rivers when it rains. The tanks that have been running hard for days without proper maintenance, start breaking down faster than the mechanics can repair them, and flanks of the advance, which should be protected by supporting infantry, are instead open stretches of forest where almost anything could be happening. What was happening, as it turned out, was that the Soviet military was watching and thinking. The commander of the Soviet 11th Army, facing von Manstein's corps, was General Vasily Morozov. He had survived Stalin's military purges of the late 1930s, which by itself said something about his ability to navigate an environment where miscalculation was fatal. His army was a mixed force of rifle divisions, cavalry units, and some armored elements, not a first-line force in the way German planners would have recognized. It was under-equipped, its units had taken serious losses, and its chain of command was under pressure from above in the form of the political oversight system that Stalin had embedded throughout the Soviet military. But Morozov understood two things that would prove decisive. He understood the ground he was standing on, and he understood that the German corps thundering toward him was running on empty. The terrain around Soltsy, a small town south of Lake Ilmen in the Novgorod region, was almost perfectly designed to punish a fast-moving armored force that had outrun its support. The Shilon River and its tributaries cut the area into a series of compartments that sharply limited the routes available to tanks and motorized vehicles. The forest was dense enough to conceal large formations of troops from aerial reconnaissance. The few roads that existed were the only viable arteries for supply columns, which meant that any force that managed to get across those roads had effectively cut the artery, and the swampy ground between the tree lines made cross-country movement by heavy vehicles a near impossibility. Morozov saw what the map and the terrain were showing him. The 8th Panzer Division had crossed the Shilon and was pushing north, separated from its support by that enormous gap. Its supply lines ran back through a narrow corridor of forest tracks that were exposed on both sides. The infantry protecting those routes was stretched thin and far behind the tanks, and the tanks themselves, brilliant as they were running low on fuel and ammunition and had no immediate prospect of resupply. So he set a trap. The counterattack that Morozov ordered was not a frontal assault on the German armor. That would have played directly into the strengths of the 8th Panzer Division's experienced crews and the tactical superiority that German combined arms doctrine gave them in open engagement. Instead, Morozov designed a double envelopment, a classic pincer movement aimed not at destroying the German tanks in direct combat, but at isolating them completely. The goal was to cut the supply corridor, surround the forward elements, and turn the German advance into a pocket from which escape would require paying a very high price. The execution used a forest as its primary weapon. Soviet units moved along the flanks of the German advance corridor under tree cover that made aerial observation almost useless. They worked their way toward the road junctions and river crossings that the German supply columns depended on. They moved with enough coordination to create simultaneous pressure at multiple points along the corridor, and they did it without the kind of radio traffic and vehicle movement that might have given German intelligence a clear warning of what was coming. When the trap began to close, it did not close with a single dramatic moment. It manifested first in the supply system. Columns heading forward to the tanks started encountering resistance where there should have been nothing. Reports of Soviet forces operating in the rear began accumulating faster than they could be explained as isolated stragglers. The fuel that the forward elements of the 8th Panzer Division needed to keep moving was sitting in trucks that could not get through. The corridor that the Corps had carved through the Soviet position was being squeezed from both sides by forces that had materialized from the trees. Von Manstein understood the situation quickly. His corps was in serious trouble. The lead division was north of the Shilon, low on fuel and ammunition, its flanks exposed, its supply lines under active attack. The 3rd Motorized Division and the 121st Infantry were too far back and too dispersed to provide immediate relief. The corps above him was committed in other sectors and could not redirect significant forces fast enough to matter. The 8th Panzer Division, the jewel of his command, was being strangled by its own overextension. The response was to call in air support, which was the standard German answer to a crisis when ground forces were stretched beyond their immediate capacity. The Luftwaffe struck at Soviet concentrations along the flanks of the corridor with ground attack aircraft. But even the Stuka pilots, who were exceptionally good at their job, found that dense forest was a genuinely difficult environment for precision attack. The targets they needed to hit were under tree cover that absorbed blast and concealed positions. The close air support that had been so decisive in France and Poland was still effective, but it was working at a fraction of its normal efficiency in a landscape that had been designed by nature to defeat it. Inside the pocket, the soldiers of the 8th Panzer Division were experiencing something qualitatively different from anything they had encountered before. In France, when situations became difficult, the combination of air support, fast communications, and flexible command had consistently produced solutions before bad situations became catastrophic. In the forest south of Lake Ilmen, those tools were not performing at their normal level. Radio communications were degraded by the vegetation. The chain of command was working with fragmentary and contradictory information. The mechanics who should have been keeping the tanks running were sitting behind the traffic jams on the forest tracks, with spare parts they could not deliver. The infantry of the 3rd Motorized Division, fighting its way forward to reopen the corridor, was discovering a kind of combat that bore almost no resemblance to the war described in training manuals. Ambushes on forest tracks were the first sign of a Soviet position. Was the collapse of the column's lead element. Machine gun nests embedded in the undergrowth at positions where the terrain funneled attackers into killing grounds. Ground that looked passable on a map and turned out to be a bog that swallowed vehicles to their axles. The visibility that made German tactical coordination so effective in open terrain was gone, replaced by a wall of trees that reduced every engagement to a close-range fight where the defender's knowledge of the ground was a decisive advantage. This was the inversion that the northwest Russian forest imposed on the combat equation. German tactical superiority, which was real and substantial, depended on conditions where combined arms coordination could function, where artillery observers could see their targets, where armor and infantry could maneuver in relation to each other across open ground. In the forest, each of those dependencies became a liability. A Soviet rifle company with a well-prepared position could hold up a German battalion for hours, not because it was better equipped or better trained in any absolute sense, but because the terrain multiplied its defensive effectiveness while canceling out a significant portion of the attacker's advantages. What do you think actually decides the outcome of a battle? The quality of the weapons, the skill of the commanders, or the ground beneath everyone's feet? Drop your answer in the comments, because this question matters more than most people realize. While the German infantry was fighting through the forest to relieve the trapped armor, von Manstein was working through the mathematics of a decision he did not want to make. The 8th Panzer Division north of the Shilon needed to withdraw. Its fuel state made continued offensive operations impossible. Its ammunition was critically low. Keeping it north of the river while the supply corridor remained cut was not a viable option. The only tactically sound choice was to pull back the most exposed elements to positions that could be supplied and defended while the Corps reorganized for renewed advance. In the context of a campaign built entirely on the narrative of unstoppable forward momentum, ordering a withdrawal was deeply painful. It contradicted everything that Barbarossa was supposed to represent. But von Manstein was a professional who understood that the alternative, losing the 8th Panzer Division as a fighting force, was a price no operational objective could justify. He gave the order. The withdrawal itself was not a clean operation. The tanks needed fuel to move back, and the fuel was on the wrong side of the Soviet forces cutting the corridor. The infantry covering the retreat was spread across multiple contact points and could not consolidate quickly. The bridges over the Shilon that had been crossed so easily in the advance were now under pressure from Soviet forces trying to cut the line of retreat. Every kilometer of ground given up required a combat action to execute, and every combat action consumed the ammunition and fuel that the division was already critically short of. The retreat cost blood and material at a moment when neither could be easily replaced. When the crisis finally stabilized, when the corridor was reopened and the 8th Panzer Division had pulled back to positions it could supply and hold, the count of what had been lost was not catastrophic in absolute terms. The division had not been destroyed. Von Manstein had not been captured. The 56th Corps had not suffered a collapse of command or cohesion. The German military's professionalism and the eventual weight of Luftwaffe support had prevented the trap from closing completely. But the cost in time was real, and it was significant. Approximately 1 week. That is what the counteroffensive at Soltsy cost Army Group North's advance on Leningrad. 1 week during which the 56th Corps reorganized, resupplied, treated its wounded, prepared its vehicles, and prepared to resume operations. 1 week that sounds modest in the context of a campaign that lasted years, but was enormously expensive at the specific moment in which it occurred, because that week, and the others like it that accumulated through the summer of 1941, for various reasons across the Army Group North Front, was a week that Leningrad used. The city's defenders were not sitting idle. Every day of delayed German advance was a day of additional preparation. The civilian population was organized into labor brigades that dug anti-tank ditches, constructed firing positions, built layered defensive lines across the approaches to the city from the south and southwest. The factories that produced nearly half of the Soviet Union's precision machinery were being converted to war production. Food reserves were being calculated and distributed. The fortifications that would eventually make Leningrad one of the most formidable defensive positions in the history of warfare were being built one day at a time, and each of those days had been bought somewhere on the road between the German start lines and the city. Soltsy bought some of those days, not many in the total arithmetic of a siege that would last almost 900 days, but in the critical window of July and August 1941, when the city was at its most vulnerable, before the defensive lines had reached their full depth, and before the Soviet command had brought up the forces that would eventually stabilize the front. The days that the 56th Corps spent recovering from the forest south of Lake Ilmen were days that the defenders of Leningrad used to become harder to kill. There is a deeper significance to Soltsy that goes beyond the operational accounting of time and distance. It is what the battle revealed about the fundamental premise on which Barbarossa had been built. The German plan rested on several assumptions, and while not all of them were equally wrong, they were wrong enough that their cumulative effect would eventually determine the outcome of the entire war in the East. The assumption that the Red Army would collapse under sustained pressure the way the Polish and French armies had collapsed ignored the difference in strategic depth, in the capacity to generate reserves from a population of over 150 million people, and in the fundamental resilience of a system that had been built to absorb punishment that would destroy any Western European state. The assumption that German tactical superiority could compensate for every disadvantage indefinitely ignored the reality that tactical advantages have their own culminating point when applied in conditions sufficiently different from those for which they were designed. And the assumption that Soltsy challenged most directly was the one that the Soviet military was operationally incapable of complex maneuver. The narrative the German command had constructed in the first weeks of Barbarossa was of a Red Army in terminal disintegration, incapable of coordinated response, reduced to local and disorganized reactions to the German advance. That narrative was not entirely wrong. There was real disintegration happening across enormous stretches of the front. The losses in men, equipment, and territory that the Soviet military suffered in the opening months of the campaign were of a scale that defies easy comprehension. But Soltsy showed that within that disintegrating system, there were islands of operational competence. Morozov had seen what von Manstein's overextension created and had acted on it with enough coordination to produce a genuine crisis for one of the best armored formations in the German army. He did not do it perfectly. The encirclement did not hold, and the 8th Panzer Division was not destroyed, but he did it well enough to stop the advance, to force a withdrawal, and to extract a week from the German timetable that his army simply had no right to take, given everything that was happening everywhere else. That matters because it tells us something important about where the Soviet capacity for eventual recovery came from. It was not something that appeared suddenly at Moscow in December 1941 or at Stalingrad a year later. It was present from the very beginning, in battered formations operating with broken communications and inadequate resources, and commanders who were working with incomplete information in a system that was simultaneously fighting a war and devouring its own officers through paranoia and political pressure. The resilience was always there. It just took time for the conditions to align in ways that allowed it to express itself consistently at the operational level. For von Manstein personally, Soltsy was a moment of genuine reckoning, though he was far too disciplined to allow it to show as anything other than professional recalibration. His memoirs, written after the war in the complex light of Germany's total defeat, acknowledged the difficulty of the situation and gave measured credit to the quality of the Soviet response. What the episode showed him was that the adversary he was facing in the East was not the same adversary he had defeated in France. This was something different, something that could be hit hard, driven back, apparently broken, and still find the coherence to turn around and cut your supply lines in the forest while you were still celebrating the advance. The strategic consequences of Soltsy unfolded over months rather than days, which is why it is so easy to overlook in histories dominated by the larger set pieces of the Eastern Front. It was not Stalingrad. It was not Kursk. It was not one of the battles that appears in every survey of the Second World War as a clear turning point. It was something smaller and in some ways more revealing precisely because of its scale. It was the kind of episode that shows you the texture of a war rather than its headline moments, the granular reality of what it actually meant to fight in that environment against that opponent with those assumptions about what was possible and what was not. The week that the 56th Corps lost to the forest south of Lake Ilmen was added to the accumulating total of delays, setbacks, and unexpected resistances that prevented Army Group North from completing its mission before the winter of 1941 closed down large-scale mobile operations. The siege of Leningrad that finally formed in September of that year was not the rapid conquest that Barbarossa had envisioned. The city held. It held through conditions of starvation and bombardment that killed hundreds of thousands of its inhabitants in one of the most terrible sustained ordeals inflicted on any civilian population in the history of warfare. And it never fell. The weeks bought at places like Soltsy, one at a time, in engagements that individually seemed containable and manageable from the German perspective, were part of the reason why. Not the whole reason, not even the main reason, but part of the architecture of resilience that made Leningrad's survival possible. What Soltsy ultimately demonstrates, across the distance of more than 80 years, is something that applies far beyond the specific events of July 1941 in a forgotten corner of northwest Russia. Speed without sustainability is not strength. It is a clock counting down to the moment when the ground beneath you stops cooperating and the enemy you assumed was broken starts acting like he never got the message. The German Blitzkrieg was a genuinely revolutionary approach to warfare that changed how armies thought about time and space on the battlefield. But it was not magic. It had limits, and the northwest Russian forest was one of the places where those limits became visible in the most concrete way possible, measured in fuel gauges touching empty and supply columns that could not get through and a week of an advance that simply stopped. The men who fought in those forests on both sides were operating at the intersection of doctrine and reality, the place where theories about how war works meet the actual ground with its actual mud and its actual trees and its actual enemy, who has not read your planning documents and does not intend to behave as predicted. That intersection is where wars are actually decided, not in the planning rooms and not in the commemorations afterward, but in the moments when everything that was supposed to work encounters everything that the world actually is. And in July of 1941, in the swamp south of Lake Ilmen, what the world actually was turned out to be more than the 56th Panzer Corps had bargained for. Some of you are already subscribed. Thank you genuinely. If you are not yet, this is your sign. Join us. There is much more coming.